By the 1950s, the dating landscape had changed considerably. Going steady, or having just one partner, became the in thing. This focused approach to dating may have provided a measure of security from the pressures of the post-war world, noted the historian Bailey. Now, the World War, or World War II, also saw marriage rates increase, partly due to the fear that a partner might not return from battle. Women wanted to enjoy married life for as long as possible, in the anticipation their husbands may be drafted. And this fear was understandable, given the US's involvement in the Korean War. That was between 1950 and 1953, by the way. The Korean War spanned 3 years, June 1950 to June 1953, just as I said. The number of troops swelled from 600,000 in 1949 to 1950 to 1.5 million in 1951. The minimum age for draftees was lowered from 21 to 18 as the war progressed, and in many ways, if the women had had a similar appetite to engage in war on the war front as they had for the vote, then it's debatable whether the minimum age would have actually dropped. Teamwork makes the dream work, but of course the gender tinkering, in terms of gender role tinkering, also is going to have some double standards, and that is one of them. In any case, the US sustained 36,000 casualties from the Korean War, and it was the US's second most deadliest conflict of the Cold War, and the fifth deadliest after the Vietnam War, the World War I, World War II, and the Civil War, in terms of the numbers of casualties and fatalities. Of note, many had delayed marriage during the Depression, and naturally, an improving economy, as I said a few moments ago, finally allowed them to marry. Marriage ages also lowered, and in 1939, for example, 47% of new brides were married at an average age of 23. By 1959, 47% of US women married before age 19, and that really underlines the appetite that the young women at that time would have been really hungry for, right? So that would have comprised, at that point in time, a lot of the silent generation lot. They would have been born in the late 1920s, so they would have been coming of age in the 1940s. Yeah, of course. So anyway, dating was this point in time, it was an inevitable prelude for marriage. Marriage was inevitable. It was very clear in its outcome. It didn't have all of the grey area that we see today. But in any case, now this is a section within part 2, right? And it's titled A Changing of the Tide, Politics, Popular Culture, and the Sex Revolution in the 1960s. And honestly speaking, given just how conservative the 1950s were, the 1960s took a significant turn away from the conservative mores of the 1950s. But as I'm going to show over the course of this subsection, there's some important clips that challenge the idea that the 1950s was as conservative as we're led to believe. And also the makings of the emergence of that liberalism. What was the attitude? What was the spirit of the times? What did the parents of the young generation growing up in the 1960s, those would have been the older boomers, mind you, what did they make of the unfolding events culturally? Because I'm actually looking forward to showing you some clips. Honestly, I'm rubbing my hands in case you can hear any background noise. Rubbing my hands in anticipation. But yes, without further ado, we're about to dive into a changing of the tide. Politics, popular culture, and the sex revolution, the 1960s edition. And I'm just, as you can see on the screen, there's a collection of pictures that really underline the spirit of the times. So I'll just let you capture that for a moment and let it marinate. You know, images are important. They say a picture tells 1,000 words, and we've got 5 pictures here, so that's 5,000 words. Yeah, soak it up. And moving on. Yeah, so here are some clips which really inform the spirit of the times. So, the onset of the 1960s birthed a liberal countercultural revolution across the US and much of the Western world. It can be argued that this was an inevitability following the conditions of the 1950s. And in the US in the 1950s, social order was heavily emphasized and part of the government propaganda to win the culture and economic war against communism. And in the US in the 1950s, social order was heavily emphasized and part of government propaganda to win the culture and economic war against communism. And as you are about to see, portrayals of American family life was considered patriotic and wholesome. The image of the 2.4 nuclear household with the picket fence became emblematic and reflected quintessential American day-to-day life. And family-centered consumerism was a key feature of this. Successful marriages meant that Americans were committed to their families and further to the nation. The prioritization of domestic stability meant that in the 1950s, strict abstinence was encouraged and normalized. Dating and going steady was a prelude to marriage, as I said a bit earlier. But one thing parents hadn't preempted was sex, and all things sex.
In the 60s, great numbers of young people would, quote, do their own thing.
Yoo-hoo!
Jenny thinks that she has the key to popularity, parking in cars with the boys at night. When Jerry brags about taking Jenny out, he learns that she dates all the boys. What about Jenny? Does that make her really popular? Do the boys and girls like her? Is she welcome to join this group?
Hi, Betty, Ellie. You can rest your tray here, Jenny, for a minute. Thanks. Say, Wally, how's the play coming along?
Oh, okay, Jenny. Here, Jenny.
No,
Thanks,
girls
Jerry.
who park in cars are not really popular. Not even with the boys they park with. Not when they meet at school or elsewhere.
Nothing like being Miss Popularity.
Yeah.
I think that there was this sense that, yeah, well, sure, they're using sex to be popular now, but, you know, what about in the future? They're going to be, like, thrown in the rubbish pile. And I think that did happen, because I think that boys did maintain an attitude of, you know, they wanted to get laid, but they wanted to marry a virgin.
Jeff, isn't that Eileen?
It sure is. Baby and all.
Gee, I haven't seen her since she left school.
And maybe this was the biggest rule of all. Don't even think about having sex. In the 60s, young people all over the country would proclaim, if it feels good, do it.
Moreover, the 1960s cultural movement, particularly the sex revolution, significantly impacted dating. This marked the, shall I say, second iteration of pre-digital / analog hookup culture. And casual sex became commonplace with no expectation whatsoever of entering a committed relationship beyond the do, or as they say where I come from, bedmatics. Previous conservative-leaning values on sex were supplanted as traditional sexual norms became a thing of the past. Premarital sex became more acceptable. Increased access to birth control also enabled sexual exploration on a large scale. And these changes were consistent with the onset of hippie culture. And of course, hippie culture was anti-war and pro-peace, reflected in the iconography of the era, much of which has enduring popularity to the present day. And of course, for many people who have spoken to people that came up in the 60s, a lot of them had this tendency of saying, back in my day, we used to do this, the 60s were. So in other words, they were just having that nostalgia. And prior to actually doing the research for this series, I kinda couldn't really relate, but I'll be honest, yeah, I get where they were coming from. I really do. Now, the swinging 60s also had a UK pop culture and sex revolution chapter. Much like the US's cultural milieu, this countercultural movement emerged following the economic recovery in the aftermath of the post-World War II austerity. Such social changes led to London's metamorphosis from a gloomy, grimy post-war capital into a bright, shining epicenter of style. The so-called British invasion was a cultural phenomenon of the mid-1960s when rock and pop music acts from the UK and other aspects of British culture became popular in the US. It was significantly influential on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and among the popular music acts were the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bee Gees, Pink Floyd, and Cilla Black. The sexual revolution arguably marked the stage in which post-war Britain became more open and comfortable with discussing sexual norms. Enjoying the abolition of the national service for men in 1960, these young people enjoyed greater freedom and fewer responsibilities than their parents' generation, and fan changes to social and sexual politics. Changes as a result of the sexual revolution in both privacy and premarital sex meant that individuals were more open to discuss and engage in sexual activities. And this can be assessed through the comparison with attitudes prior to the 1960s. One aspect that was common amongst many married couples before the sexual revolution was the importance of privacy, allowing these couples to see themselves as a distinct and separate unit from wider society. By doing so, an intimate bond was created separate from experiences in other social relationships. In 1950, when Mass Observation published a summary of their Little Kinsey sex survey in Public Opinion Quarterly, individuals were so confused they had no idea what sexual practices normal or commonplace were. With individuals being taught through one's own sexual experiences in their marriage, it is evident that sex education prior to the sexual revolution was something taught later in life. Second, state involvement in marriage and sex-related issues was not as evident to the level seen after the revolution. Another aspect that was particularly common before the sex revolution was the level of abstinence amongst couples, with many waiting until marriage. Woodside and Slater's research found that 45% of husbands and 64% of wives from the control group in the 1930s claimed to be virgins upon marriage. Now, this could have largely been due to contraception not being widely accessible to all doctors or to all. Now, this could have been largely due to contraception not being widely accessible to all people with doctors, given there was reluctance by doctors to give, as well as working class women's reluctance. Oh my goodness. It's possible that this was due to contraception not being widely accessible. Doctors were reluctant to give such prescriptions, as it's also worth noting that working class women were reluctant to use it. And Now, this could have been largely due to contraception not being widely accessible to all with doctors, given the doctor's reluctance to give prescriptions for contraception. And also, if need be, there was family planning association clinics. And if accessible, family planning association clinics would only supply such contraception to married women or engaged women who could supply evidence of an impending marriage. Within popular culture, there was a clear distinction of the nice girl trope that was prevalent during their adolescence. This was largely linked to the idea of femininity being gentle, good and chaste, as discussed by Greer Fox in the 1970s, whether it be challenging the idea or suggesting girls should follow it. And this concept acknowledged the existence of extramarital sex and that it could indeed be enjoyable. However, boys did not want to marry girls who had reputations for being scrubbers. This sexual culture thus suggests that even during the years of the sexual revolution for women, stages of life were expected for them to one day result in becoming married and also mothers. The introduction of the pill in 1961 was arguably one of the biggest events for the sex revolution, which would in turn affect married heterosexuals as well as shifting the conversation on contraception from the private to the public sphere. The British Medical Association, once unsure of the use of barrier contraceptives, had a largely positive response about the pill, as it had the ability to create a large profit. The pill became the only drug which doctors were permitted to charge the NHS patients a fee. If the purpose of the use was not given for medical reasons, this supports the change by 1971, when 1.8 million women were using it, as compared to just 480,000 in 1964 upon its introduction. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 largely addressed Jim Crow and the structural inequalities that black men primarily experienced. This also considered the huge chasm in the allocation of resources to white veterans by virtue of the GI Bill, in stark contrast to their black counterparts. However, the intentions of the acts were commandeered by the Now movement. The scope of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the grounds of race, colour, religion or national origin. The above categories would now ostensibly receive greater job protection where they otherwise would have been impeded, as well as other social goods. The scope of the law did not initially address women's nuanced needs. This unequivocally prompted the establishment of the National Organization for Women in 1966, and now pressed the case / lobbied for laws that gave express civil rights and gender equality to women expressly on account of their gender. Introducing Betty Friedan. The Now movement and the onset of second wave feminism, which is the subtitle to, of course, the Lateness of the Hour series. Dubbed the mother of feminism, Betty Friedan was an American writer and author. She is renowned for her highly popular book, The Feminine Mystique, released in 1963. The book and political developments in this milieu very much influenced present-day feminism, and when she first emerged in the political arena, she eschewed sexual liberation ideas. She contrarily fought for women's freedom in the public square, the workforce and academia, her political position was largely influenced by Betty sacking from her job in the 1940s for being pregnant. This fate also inspired feminist ideology in the likes of journalist and author of Subverted, Sue Ellen Browder, who is another influential figure in the second wave feminist movement. Friedan was initially against the sexual liberation movement. Moreover, she was vehemently against the brand of feminism pushed by Helen Gurley Brown. Introducing Mrs. Gurley Brown. Now, Brown authored the bestseller Sex and the Single Girl, released in 1962 and made into a movie in 1964. This here is a clip of the film. And the Sex and the Single Girl was arguably one of the most influential productions that set the tone for commercializing sex work for women's consumption. Sex and the Single Girl was arguably one of the most influential productions that set the tone for commercializing sex for women's consumption. Brown became the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine in 1965, and she subsequently embarked on a transformation of what was then a home magazine into the female equivalent of Playboy magazine, according to its founder, Hugh Hefner. I want you to really marinate on that. She subsequently embarked on a transformation from what was a home magazine, which of course would have been around that 40s, 30s, kind of into war and war period, right? Into the equivalent, the female equivalent of the Playboy magazine. And this here is according to its late founder, Hugh Hefner. You can take that to the bank.